All right, nostalgia trappers, David Parsons here. What is happening? I hope you're doing well. I hope you're ready for the start of a very, very intense set of conversations with my friend Justin RogersCooper, someone who I wanted to talk to about Howard Zinn. You know, Howard Zinn is a character that looms large, I think, on the left, particularly people that have read his book, A People's History of the United States, but also just as a figure not unlike Noam Chomsky, a major left intellectual. It's kind of stunning to me, and I think I say this in this conversation, that we haven't done an in-depth, detailed look at Howard Zinn's life and work. So we are correcting that right now by starting this trilogy. This first episode here is about Zinn's life, Howard Zinn's actual life, which is kind of unbelievable. I thought I knew the details of it, but a lot of what I found out from reading his memoir, You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train, which is the book Justin and I read for this week's episode, are shocking details and things that I didn't know. And we get into, his experience in World War II, which is obviously a big part of his whole transformation, I think, into a sort of pacifist, humanitarian, anti-capitalist academic. But there's so much more. There's so many more details to who this guy is and what he became. So I hope you enjoy this. We're going to do, as I said, a trilogy on Howard Zinn. So the next episode you should stay tuned for will be on our subscriber feed. That's at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Episode 2 is about A People's History of the United States. We did a pretty detailed review and analysis of the type of history he's doing, the methodology, and the stuff that is sort of famous that he put in that book. Part of what we wanted to do here is because I'm a history professor and Justin is an English professor and approaches things through literature, we thought it might be interesting to combine those two approaches, because that's certainly what Howard Zinn's work is. So A People's History of the United States is part 2, and then part 3, also on our subscriber feed, is all about the legacy, and we look at a few other works from Zinn, including his book The Bomb, which is about not only the nuclear bomb, but the entire idea of bombing civilians. It's really, like I said, intense, crazy stuff, but I think it's important, and I think the Nostalgia Trap audience in particular would find value in us and hearing us talk about this stuff. So I hope you enjoy our Howard Zinn trilogy, which is starting right now. Here is me and Justin RogersCooper on the one and only Howard Zinn. All right, Justin RogersCooper, how's it going? Good to see you.
Doing well. Kind of in the 24-hour twilight of the booster shot. And I just saw my old poetry professor from Skidmore over in Park Slope like a minute ago, and we hadn't connected for 15 years. And
oh, wow.
that was a joyous occasion, and I talked about Zinn to them. And I'm looking forward to talking about Zinn to you.
Hell yeah. That was not a Zoom meeting then. That was an actual face-to-face meeting?
Yeah, we saw them. They have a place over on 4th Street.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, Howard Zinn is the subject of today and a couple extra episodes. We're going to do a trilogy on Howard Zinn. It's kind of amazing to me that we've never really talked, whether it be me and a guest or you and I, Justin, on this show about Howard Zinn, because in detail. I think obviously his name has come up a ton. And I think the most common story I've told on this podcast is how is a common one that people tell about Howard Zinn, actually, which is that after 9/11 happened, I was a couple years out of college, and a roommate of mine brought home a copy of the book A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, and he was really excited, and he said, this is the shit we got to learn right now, because like 9/11 happened and we don't know what's going on. And this is the book that's like going to tell us the real history of America. And so I started reading that book as I was like a temp, in LA, like at my lunch hour. And I really enjoyed it. And I really felt like my mind was blown by it. And it actually, long story short, it probably I could credit it with leading me towards a more advanced engagement with American history and ultimately wanting to go to graduate school and study it. So imagine my surprise when I get to graduate school and I quickly understand that Howard Zinn is persona non grata in graduate school. Like in a PhD history department, you can't bring up Howard Zinn's name and be taken seriously. And you and I mentioned this offline yesterday. It's a little bit like saying you want to do your dissertation on Joseph Campbell. It's sort of like, well, that's not taken seriously at all. So I began to think about that, and I think this is kind of the thrust of what you and I would like to sort of address, this contradiction in Zinn and his work and his reception in academia versus the sort of like American public and the global public, because this is a seriously popular book, sold millions of copies. It's probably one of the most popular works of like survey American history out there. And yet in the academy, professors don't take this seriously. And we'll get into that when we talk about the actual work. But I thought today would be a good opportunity to sort of start off by thinking about Howard Zinn, the person, who this guy was. Because as much as I have thought a lot about Zinn over the years, and I definitely used to watch him on videos and anti-war rallies, and always associated him with like Noam Chomsky and other activist anti-war academics. I think it's worth thinking about who this guy is and what his life has been. So you and I have now read his memoir, You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train, and watched the Matt Damon narrated documentary as well. And we could talk a little bit about the relationship between those two things. But actually, I learned a lot. I learned a lot from both of those pieces about Howard Zinn's life. I thought I had known really the rough outlines, but there's a lot of detail there. So were you surprised by anything you learned about Howard Zinn's life? I think we can go through it in stages here, but
I love your introduction to this episode in part because it's nice to think of you reading his work and sort of taking a step towards the CUNY Graduate Center. And I do think your sort of comment on the absence of a crowd of people taking his work seriously at the Graduate Center is kind of ironic on a number of levels, but one of them is just ironic because the Graduate Center is at a minimum a center-left institution with some radical pockets. And so why wouldn't a radical historian, but also just kind of a radical intellectual, a kind of intellectual activist, why wouldn't he have more professional capital among well-trained PhD students and their well-trained faculty? And I think that is part of, if not it is part of the story that we want to get at and tell. And I'll add two things to that. One, just in terms of my overall surprise before we maybe dive into his early life here, he just comes across as such an optimistic, likable person. He popped off the page, and I hadn't had a lot of experience with his work. I had never read this book before, and I hadn't watched many videos of him. I was an English guy, not a history guy. So I respected Zinn from afar, but I kind of always thought that I knew what he was talking about. I was wrong. I did judge the book by its cover, but like in a sympathetic way. Mm-hmm. I just didn't think that I was going to learn much from that point of view, which, in other words, I think I'm a little bit guilty of the thing that we're talking about that was going on at the Graduate Center. Yeah. If not like specifically guilty, at a minimum, unconsciously guilty. And he just comes across as such a likable guy. And I think the other part of his life story that caught my attention was the sense of solidarity that he described over and over with different kinds of communities. One of those communities was when he was in the South at Spelman, actively participating in the civil rights movement and encouraging his students to do so, to the point where even as a tenured faculty, he was terminated by the president of Spelman College and went up to Boston, ends up at BU, where he joins the anti-war movement, but in a rather incredible way. Mm-hmm. And he had a sort of, based on this this memoir, which is really not self-aggrandizing, and like 60% of it is just stories of other people. And I think that's extremely significant to say at the outset. you get a real sense that this was a person who was deeply respected by his contemporaries in his own time. And so whatever was no longer being reproduced in the classrooms at the Graduate Center in the early 21st century, whatever wasn't being reproduced was in some sense missing something critical about the active life of this radical intellectual and all the people that he came in contact with in the places that he went. And I'll end it by saying this, and we can get to this later, because I do want to dip into what you call his Dickensian childhood here. But it's remarkable that in, what was it, the early 70s, that when the North Vietnamese said, we're going to have a prisoner exchange of 3 GIs, and this is one of the first prisoner exchanges, and we're looking for like reputable anti-war intellectuals to come all the way to North Vietnam and pick these guys up, that they chose Zinn, and that they accepted Zinn, and that Zinn was chosen by his radical peers to go to North Vietnam. The reason I say that is because this is 13 years before the publication of A People's History. You're this right. is 13 years before Zinn was a popular historian on the page, in which he was selling something to an aggregate public that seemed to be capturing some of the charisma that he must have had in the classroom. So the fact that he was that kind of intellectual, to me, tells me there was something about his early participation in the civil rights movement and his contact with Baldwin, his contact with King, his contact with Fannie Lou Hamer, all these folks that he was, the big people that he was in contact with, they all respected him from the very get-go. And he brought that prestige, if you will, not really the right word, but he brought that legacy to the anti-war movement. And that, to me, because it didn't show up in like the kind of context of people's history, that to me is really interesting aspects of his life that did surprise me at the outset.
Yeah, I agree. The activist scholar part of it, and the sort of idea of what is a scholar and what is the responsibility of. I mean, Noam Chomsky is known for writing The Responsibility of Intellectuals in, I think, the late '60s, and it's sort of about, about Vietnam and about the civil rights movement and about a lot of the stuff that Zinn was doing. And it's so amazing because you're right, the book is not self-aggrandizing it, and yet it's crazy to hear him just casually drop that, like, and then James Baldwin and I were having coffee, and he said something that blew my mind, and you're like, what the fuck? Like, that's amazing. So let's talk a little bit about his life, because again, I didn't really know it. I sort of suspected that he had a working class background because it's such an important part of the history he wants to tell, is the story of workers, and I mean, ultimately he becomes like he gives us, whether he would say this or not, he gives us a sort of like basic Marxian view of American history, and we get that in this story. But his childhood is intense, man. He lives in New York City. He's the child of working class immigrants who actually his mother and father met in a factory, and they had a number of like barely making it jobs, it sounds like. And the thing that stuck out to me, I don't know what stuck out to you, but there were 2 things about his childhood that stuck out. One was him saying that, he had to share a bed with his brothers, and that the rooms were in the places where they were staying were often cold water flats, not comfortable houses. So he spent a lot of his time on the street because the house sucked. It was dark, it was cold, and it was crowded. So he was on the street a lot, and he sort of had that street education of like being, with other kids. And it was on the street where he met other communist kids, which is really sort of interesting to me, that like he's not finding the communist kids online, on some Twitter page. He is instead finding them on the streets, and he attends anti-war rallies and realizes that there's this whole politics. That's what stuck out to me about his childhood, is sort of the class consciousness, and then the presence of a real political consciousness pretty early in his life. I think he was 18 years old when he was trying to agitate at work around like union issues and stuff like that.
Yeah, totally. The level of poverty he grew up in is memorable. And there was this moment of his description of Brooklyn, the slums of Brooklyn in the 1930s. And he says, we were saved by these folks in these positions of small business. He says, the corner grocer who gave credit by writing down the day's purchases on a roll of paper. The kind doctor who treated my rickets for years without charging. Uncle Phil, whose army service had earned him a newsstand license and who loaned us money when we had trouble paying the rent. And he goes on to actually say that they were kicked, they couldn't pay the rent so often that they were either kicked out of their apartments or they moved out before the first of the month, and they were constantly on the go in a way that we associate with like the Bowery of the 1880s or the actual sort of gilded age of the U.S. that we associate with the late 19th and early 20th century. That there's a part of this, there's a part of his deep background there that's that is connected to the Triangle Fire, the way something you've written about before.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, something that he's going to make, I mean, the Triangle Fire, I think, is like one of the big set pieces of one of his chapters in A People's History, because it's so gut-wrenching, but it's also a really key window into the sort of political economy of labor in New York City during that period.
Yeah. I think one thing that Zinn gets, first of all, you can tell from this autobiography that he's a terrific writer. The details that he gives pop off the page, and it reads almost like a novel or fiction. He's not a historian writing a memoir. He's like a memoirist who happens to be a historian. And one of the things that he says about his father during this time period also really struck me. And his father's name was Eddie. And he has these incredible details about Eddie and all the odd jobs that his father Eddie would have to take. And he says at one point in this chapter, he says, all his life he worked hard for very little. I've always resented the smug statements of politicians, media commentators, corporate executives who talked of how in America, if you worked hard, you'd become rich. The meaning of that was if you were poor, it was because you hadn't worked hard enough. I knew this was a lie. And my father and millions of others, men and women who worked harder than anyone, harder than financiers and politicians, harder than anybody, if you accept that when you work at an unpleasant job that it makes it very hard work indeed. And those descriptions of his parents struggling are visceral, they're compelling, they're emotional, and you kind of, this is what he says, you understand better the person he became by listening to those details of the kind of the poor world in which he grew up in. And I'll just connect it to one thing that you mentioned about those communists. It does seem like an apt revelation that like his awakening as like a radical occurred in Times Square when these communists drag him to a protest that he thinks just like what the cool kids are doing.
Right.
And he gets to Times Square on a typical evening night and they're all telling him, wait for 10 o'clock, you know, and 10 o'clock rolls around and all these people like throw out some signs and it's kind of like a red flag atmosphere. He thinks it might've been a pacifist protest. He can't even remember. And he says, we were just like out there doing it, like having a time, staying on the sidewalk, not blocking traffic. And he's beaten unconscious suddenly by one of these New York cops. And he wakes up an hour later, you know, basically with a concussion, bleeding in a corner. The protest is gone. And he's like, where the fuck am I? You know, and then at that moment he said, I thought this was land of the free. I thought this was home of the brave. And so you have this initiation into radicalism through policing, through the prison state, through the long arm of like the incarceration, but also what he later calls the topsy-turviness of the law itself, that he begins to realize that the law, but also the people enforcing it, are there to beat back people that don't have these normative ideas about the system, whether that's about war or capitalism or whatever. And that he kind of thinks and relates later, this is the moment that changed his life. The only part that I would want to say is it struck me that the same thing happened in January 1874 at the Tompkins Square quote unquote riot, where you had all these homeless families congregating Tompkins Square Park. And very famously, they're out there being like, blood or bread, you know, we need unemployment, we need work, you know, give us municipal labor, give us a minimum wage. They're saying all that stuff. And the NYPD just opens on them and just cracks skulls. And everybody was like, because no one at that point realized that these municipal police forces were going to so savagely beat back these ideas of radicalism. And that moment was itself a radicalizing moment for people like, I believe, Samuel Gompers and other New York intellectuals and activists and labor leaders of that moment, who they saw that police reaction and said, holy shit, something's wrong. Yeah. And it was that same twist of thought And I thought that was relevant because even though Zinn doesn't make that connection, I know that he talks about that in people's history. I'm pretty sure, and I'll be looking to see what he says at that point.
Yeah, the sense of the thing that comes out throughout Howard Zinn's life and work in these memoirs is he has a very earnest sense of democracy and a very earnest appreciation for when the levers of democracy are pulled in unjust ways. And he's really like, that sense of outrage about injustice and that sense of outrage about unfairness is something that, it seems like it does come from an experience of poverty when he's a kid. But it also comes from, this sense that there should be that there's a right and wrong. There's like a morality to we put it as romance. There's like a romanticism to Howard Zinn about that he gets beaten by the police at this rally, and you like, part of it reads as someone who's naive. It's like, well, you're a bunch of communists with signs in Times Square. Of course the police are going to beat the shit out of you. But the other part of me like needs to get out of that sort of cynical viewpoint and of being like, well, of course, what did you expect? And be like on Howard Zinn's page where he's saying like, this is supposed to be a place where freedom of speech is the First Amendment. Like this is like in the Constitution. Like he's genuinely outraged about this hypocrisy and about this this violence that's greeting people who are just expressing a political opinion. And that outrage is going to be something that never really goes away. And like we identify, you and I think often identify it as a romantic sort of piece of him. But it also seems like it's really key in his connection to people because other people believe that too, right?
Yeah.
Like that's something that is really powerful and is going to be the base of the civil rights movement is going to be people in the South specifically saying this country is not living up to its stated principles as written in the documents that founded this country, the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, specifically the 14th Amendment, and we can get to that. But either way, it seems like that sense of justice never went away for Howard Zinn. And it's the other thing that I wanted to mention here that will maybe jump us into the next section, and you can comment on all of this, Justin, is sort of like, what is his attitude towards World War II is something that I think a lot of people need to know, sort of where the left was in the lead up to World War II, which was a lot of young leftists were, it's very famously at City College in New York City at CUNY. Kids were taking oaths in the 1930s where they're saying, I will never put on a uniform and I will never go to war for this country. Like, I'm a pacifist. But that changed with the coming of the Spanish Civil War and fascism, totalitarianism rising in Europe. And all of a sudden you had a lot of left kids that were like, I'm going to sign up for the army and I'm going to sign up for the Air Force. And that's what Howard Zinn does. So in other words, his left politics, his radical left politics led him to be an anti-fascist and join the American military as part of what he perceived to be an anti-fascist project. That to me is amazing. That, like, I've always thought that's an incredible shift that happens in the left. That like a bunch of young lefties decided to join the military and fight against fascism.
One of the stories that really popped for me that I think hits on what you just said is that he writes, there was one point in the war when he's starting to have these doubts, and he made friends with a gunner on another crew. And at a certain point, this other guy says to him, this is not a war against fascism. It's a war for empire. England, the United States, the Soviet Union, they're all corrupt states, not morally concerned about Hitlerism, just wanting to run the world themselves. It's an imperialist war. And then Zinn responds to him.
He's like, what?
Then why are you here? That's what he says.
Yeah.
And the guy says, to talk to guys like you. And then in the following passage, Zinn writes, I was astonished and deeply impressed that he'd be risking his life flying these missions, all to wage his own political warfare inside the military to persuade others of his point of view. 2 weeks after that conversation, his plane did not return from a mission. It was shot down and his whole crew was killed. And like that actually,
how nuts is that?
That got me in it, but it also reminded me of your work on the GI coffee houses, which actually come up.
Totally.
We don't have to get into it now.
Yeah.
But we have to talk about it at some point. But it reminded me that there's these guys in the military, like Zinn, but there's also these guys like the one that he just told that story about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's true for Vietnam as well. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh yeah, totally. That there's like a range of ideas and opinions among people who are there, but also like that idea the idea of people that are in the military intentionally to try to essentially indoctrinate others to their point of view is an incredible one, but one that it does come up in the coffee house thing for me. But and the larger phenomenon is that these were lefties. This was like specifically socialists who were, the DSA kids of their day, were sort of, they had an industrial attitude about, joining unions and doing factory work and going to the South and working in mines, or even joining the military, all so that they could be sort of secret agents, covert agents within those institutions, turning the population against them. And it's like, it's a fascinating idea.
Wouldn't you agree? And we can. This is going to be one of my recurring themes throughout this whole trilogy, but I don't want to get into it too much now. I just want to see what you think. Wouldn't you agree that today, that idea of infiltrating the military is a right-wing culture phenomenon, not a left-wing one, and that this is a huge difference between the culture of the 30s and the culture of the decade we're in now, which is back then you had lefties entering the military to do these kinds of things, whereas today we have groups like the Oath Keepers and Three Percenters and all kinds of militias that are like embedded in police forces and National Guard units, but also active duty Marines, active duty Army, active duty Air Force. The right wing has a huge presence in the military. To me, the left doesn't. Am I imagining things, or is that your perception as well?
No, I mean, I think that's a big question, but I think you're right. The military sort of iconography, military service itself has been the subject of a lot of ideological grappling since the beginning of this country. The whole concept of like the citizen soldier and the whole idea of like, well, what is the soldier and what responsibility does he have to, the public or to ideas of freedom, etc. But no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the military has been there's a deep strain of right wing libertarianism. I guess some of that militia stuff you're talking about, that all seems like it's a porous sort of connection with the American military in a way that we've had a couple of them on this show actually, like contemporary left military people, and they definitely seem like they're in the minority. I always appreciate what they have to say and the perspectives they're bringing, but
totally. Absolutely.
It's something that was, I don't know how organized this was during World War II either. It came out as a public problem during the Vietnam War because of its scale. There were so many like left-leaning dudes in the military that it created demonstrations. It created a visibility that led to a crisis in the American military. In World War II, this like strain of anti-imperialism that's there among the GIs is fascinating to me. To me, like part of it that, like, just to get back to Zinn, is sort of like, he talks about he was not someone who just like joined the army and like mopped floors, at some base in Germany and then came back. Like, this is a guy that actually trained to run bombing missions as a bombardier in the American Air Force. I mean, he was in planes that, as we know now, and it became a signal element of his whole life. He dropped napalm during World War II on on civilian populations. He learned later he didn't learn until 1966, I think, when he traveled to Royan, this French village, which he was ordered to drop bombs on at the end of the war. He was told that there were a bunch of Nazi soldiers that were using the village as like a shelter. he didn't know, and he was so high up in the sky that he didn't know like couldn't see anything of what he was doing. But he learns later that he dropped napalm. It was one of the first instances of the American military using napalm in a theater of war, jellied gasoline that burned these people to pieces. And he learned later that it was like more than 1,000 French civilians were killed in that bombing. And to me, like it's interesting to me to think about that Howard Zinn trained to do that. Like he trained to do that and thought it was the right thing because he thought, well, I'm killing fascists, right? Like that was ostensibly what he thought when he was learning how to do violence. Like he volunteered to do violence,
Yeah.
and then learns later the sort of complicated nature of it, and it like really fucks with him. I mean, it becomes like the signal element of who he is.
Well, I was kind of joking with you because it's actually it's extremely meaningful, but if they lose the war, he's a war criminal, and the people that gave those orders are war criminals. These are war crimes. And so the guy that you associate with people's history, the guy you associate with radical intellectual movements of the 20th century, is himself a reformed war criminal.
Yeah,
he's never really articulated that way. He goes to the edge of saying that in his work and in his own words. But there's a bit of a zing when you kind of contemplate that, even if I'm making it polemic on purpose here, in part because of the reasons you're suggesting about what it does to his own conscience and consciousness, but also because we live in a time where people struggle to be forgiven for acts like that. And there's no coming back from acts like that today, in my opinion, or at least I haven't seen it.
Mm-hmm.
And we also live in a moment where when we talk of abolition in many contexts, and when we talk of kind of ending the culture of criminal justice that leads to, the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration and et cetera, we're caught in a bind where it's hard for us to imagine what contrition is, or how do you live a life of acts that can begin to address the crimes you've committed in the past as a free person, not as an incarcerated person. And in a strange way, I don't want to make any unequivocal statements here, but as we talk and as we think about Zinn over this episode and the ones to come, I think it's very relevant that we contemplate what his life does as a story of someone who's trying to repair crimes, and what it means that he did it as a free person.
Yeah.
And what it means to be a pacifist. And with that in mind, I do think that you're right to bring up the jellied gasoline, the sticky fire, this idea of the napalm, because correct me if I'm wrong, it's a material link, not just a anecdotal link. It's a material link between Zinn's time as a soldier and Vietnam, in the Vietnam War. It's a material connection that I think that alone is worth thinking about in a way that is productive, because we often separate Vietnam from World War II. Mm-hmm. And what you're saying is that Zinn wants us to collapse some of that. And I think the use of napalm does that. There's there's one other moment right now that I just want to draw our attention to that I think rounds out what you're saying. And that is Zinn's description of what it meant to be so high in the sky and bombing people, where he says, "We saw no people, we heard no screams, we saw no blood, no torn limbs. Up there in the sky, I was," quote, "just doing my job." The explanation throughout history of warriors committing atrocities, well, maybe, but that's also very famously connected to the Nuremberg trials.
Right.
Just doing my job is Eichmann, right? So like he's making a connection here implicitly that's kind of beating around the bush, but the explicit connection is he's relating his own crimes, war crimes, to the life of Nazism, to what Nazis did in World War II. So it gives you this, both a sense of like gravity around his actions, but it also leads you to suspect, wait a minute, if Howard Zinn committed Nazi acts, are all Nazis irredeemable? And like, that's a heavy loaded statement that I'm not suggesting I know the answer to, and maybe some people could instantly answer it in the negative. But the reason I think that's so important is because that just doing my job element, he makes that direct link to Hiroshima, which is equally sort of the historical event that connects back to his beating in Times Square, but connects back to what he was doing over the French village. he kind of globalizes his own actions to the United States as a whole. And
Yeah.
I think that's something worth reflecting on.
No, that's a really intense point, and it's one that, to me, it makes me think that the way Zinn describes his time in World War II is there's a clinical sort of element to what he's describing, but he's also very careful in how he lays out what happened to him there. But I think one of the more wrenching moments for me in that whole part of the book is when he is collecting his items to go home, and he like puts all his, he has like a bunch of like documents and papers that he throws into a folder, and he's like, without even thinking, I don't know what possessed me to do this, but I had a felt tip pen and I just wrote "never again" on the folder. And I thought to myself, well, isn't that the word that's the words that people use about the Holocaust, right?
Uh-huh.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, I see you nodding your head. It's so intense that's like the words that he says, like, they just popped into my head. You know, I didn't really have a political statement to make about it. It was just, I'm not doing this ever again. You know, like never again. And to me, like it indicates that there's something really important happening on a almost subconscious level for Zinn at war, because most of him is a warrior at that moment. You know, like he's questioning. He is not yet the like the guy who's turned the guy we know that wrote A People's History of the United States, which is something that he writes almost as a coda to this long activist scholar career, which I guess we should get to, because he comes home from World War II and is on the GI Bill. And starts educating himself in colleges and ends up as a college professor. And as you mentioned, I think that the most maybe important turning point in his life in a lot of ways is being offered this job at Spelman College, which is a black university, part of the Atlanta university system that includes Morehouse and other I guess what we would call HBCUs now, right? But either way, he said, I'd never really thought about that. I never really thought about like going and like, you know, teaching at a black university. But it seemed like a good idea and it seemed like a good deal. So he goes down there and he ends up learning a lot about the racial situation in Atlanta, but not only the racial situation in Atlanta, but also like the sort of bubbling resistance that is starting to be shown by the members of the black community, by whites who are part of this movement as well. And I think it's an interesting parallel to what's happening to him in World War II, right? There's like, he's noticing consciousness, and he's all about sort of like noticing little bits of resistance that might turn into something later. I mean, maybe this is the historian in him, I think, in part, that's trying to recognize how things change. But I thought that those years that he spends at Spelman and those stories that he has to tell about being involved in the civil rights movement were a lot about sort of trying to recognize how people come to their ideas and how people put those ideas into action in often surprising ways. And it's definitely a part of his own consciousness expanding too.
One of the things I really enjoyed about the many chapters on Spelman, which when you read a book that's, you know, a third devoted to those years, 7 or 8 years, that tells you something. But one of the things that I learned about that was of his collaborative and creative and politicized relationship with his black female students. And he never really comes out and says, you know, my job was to help facilitate the emergence of like a black feminist movement at Spelman. That's like how I might put it in kind of the language of today. But it was amazing to see how he was in a classroom at a black women's school outside Atlanta, and these students came from all over the South, mostly from middle-class backgrounds, and were chafing at the restrictions and the rules of the dorms and everything else that went along with being this residential student at Spelman. And Spelman, like all of the South, was going through these, you know, churning changes at this time. And at one point, you know, Zinn says this: the events of my life growing up poor, working in a shipyard, being in a war, had nurtured an indignation against the bullies of the world. those who used wealth or military might or social status to keep others down. And now I was in the midst of a situation where human beings, by accident of birth, because of their skin color, were being treated as inferior beings. I knew that it was wrong for me, a white teacher, to lead the way. But I was open to anything my students wanted to do, refusing to accept the idea that a teacher should confine his teaching to the classroom when so much was at stake outside of it. I thought that was a wonderful passage in terms of him contextualizing where his solidarity came from and how he says, as a white teacher, I can't really know the perverse forms of racism that these students and Black communities in the South were experiencing, but he knew what the feeling of indignation was, and he knew what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a more generalized inequality that had a material effect on the way that he lived and on the way that his family lived, and that those conditions and elements were the basis, not for like an equality of suffering, if you will, but they were the basis for an emergence of solidarity. And I think one of the striking things about this text, and again, he does it in a classy way, which is to say not in a self-aggrandizing way, but there was so much mutual respect back and forth from his students to him. And I want to add this moment because he not only captures the dynamism and the creativity and the spark of the Spelman students, but also just like the Black communities that were going through the civil rights movement there in the late 50s in particular. But at one point he says, living in Atlanta those 7 tumultuous years, I learned not to trust the Northern stereotype of white Southerners as incorrigible racists. Yankee self-righteousness ignored the depth of race hatred in places like Boston or New York. And everyone is capable of change as circumstances change. The change might only be in response to self-interest, but that is a beginning, leading to deeper changes in thought and behavior. To me, that's mind-blowing shit. Like, I do not hear anyone saying that in today's discourse.
Yeah,
I'm pretty ignorant. I'm pretty isolated, but I think that is a still radical passage, if you will.
That is the anti-cancel culture perspective, honestly. You know, he's saying like, look, if we want to move things forward, we have to meet people where they are, and we have to practice like forgiveness, and a lot of that. You know, there's not a lot of religion from him. At the same time, I feel a religious sort of impulse, because that's often this sort of like attitude that you find in, I mean, my experience is as an American, just contemporary Christianity, but I know it's in all religions is sort of that like looking to people as flawed creatures that are moving towards something, moving through something difficult. It's also, I think it connects to his idea there of being like, look, like I understand the injustices that are happening to you in part because I have experienced them myself. At the same time, I'm like a white dude from New York City, so I can't like lead. I want to take your lead. Baldwin said, I thought it was really interesting that Baldwin said the same thing. That when James Baldwin gets down there, he says everyone's eager to hear him. They're like, James Baldwin, you're a famous author. Tell us what to do, And he says his response is, look, guys, like I'm new here and I just want to learn and I want to hear what's going on from you. And I thought that humility and that notion that I don't know what's going on, even though I might think I understand injustice, maybe experienced it myself, maybe read a lot of books about it, I'm a teacher, etc. I don't know, and I'd like to learn. I think that takes a lot. And you're right. There is in contemporary political discourse, there's no notion that we're going to learn. It's all about sort of owning people and saying, I know more than you. You know nothing. Here's what I know. And that to me is, that's a shitty direction to be in.
I'm sorry. There's something, just what you're saying sparks something in my head, that there is something intersecting about a culture of shaming in the way that you're describing,
Yeah.
but also a culture of punishment. So that is like a culture that wants a pure politics also often leads to become a culture that's invested in punishing people that aren't pure. And in the intro, just while we're on this subject, and we can return back, which is written by Keeanga Yamada Taylor, who I have a lot of affection for, and I was really heartened that she wrote the foreword to this.
It's amazing, right? I'm glad you mentioned that, because I did want to mention that the Black Lives Matter professor, for better or worse, is the person that writes this, and she's in many ways, I think, a contemporary sort of expression of a lot of the energy of the civil rights movement that Zinn was participating in.
That's a great point, and I'm going to reflect on that. And what she writes in the foreword connects directly to this moment in Zinn's chapter about the Spelman years. And she writes, "There are times when leftists disparage liberals for their continued faith in the system, becoming exasperated when they have not yet come to radical conclusions. Zinn makes the simple yet critical point that people make their own way to political consciousness. Quote, you read a book, you meet a person, you have a single experience, and your life is changed in some way. No act, therefore, however small, should be dismissed or ignored." And I think that speaks again to the sort of a real radical edge in Zinn's memoir, his autobiography here, and what we're saying about the kind of contrast or dissonance with contemporary culture, definitely the contemporary left, which spends a lot of its time at war with the center and with liberals in particular. And it also affirms your sense that, if not religious, there is something like a spiritual conviction in Zinn's claim that Taylor is quoting here. No act, therefore, however small, should be dismissed or ignored. First of all, that sounds like a moral claim or a spiritual claim. Or, I was joking with you earlier, like the Zen, the Zen of Zen. That's my dad joke for the day. But like, there's a little bit of a Zen of Zen here in this moment that I think it's relative politically. And it doesn't feel good because it's not burning your enemy with fire. But Zinn is someone who's burned his enemies with fire, literally. And he's walking back from that place and saying, this isn't actually the path to a purified politics. That destroying the people that you disagree with doesn't actually produce the political results you think it does.
Imagine if it is. Imagine if that guy that talked to him in World War II, that bomber who told him this war is an imperialist war, which was, one of those moments that Zinn is talking about and Taylor's talking about too, which is sort of like the notion that you can be surprised by conversations and small moments that happen that end up being something that you're going to ruminate on for a long time and end up becoming a part of your story. Imagine if the bomber in in World War II had been like to Zinn, his attitude had been like, "What? You don't know that this is an anti-imperialist war? What are you, stupid? Why don't you read a book? It's not my job. It's not my job to educate you." What if the bomber had been that way? Like instead,
clapping back to Zinn on Twitter.
It's like, I mean, the idea of just constantly like owning people for being wrong, it's just so silly to me, because it's not really putting a hand out. It's not putting a hand out in the way that it needs to be put out. I don't know. Those are big issues, but to me, these are things that are going to animate the way that Zinn moves through the left during the 1960s, because, as you mentioned, he gets fired from Spelman College, and there's a lot that happens there. But he gets fired for being political, and the way they do it is, it's dirty, man. They give him a letter and tell him June 30th is your last day here. It was right after the students had already left the school, which is really interesting because later on at Boston University, Zinn's students are going to be sort of his protectors. Like, he always has like hundreds of students who love him, and the administration has a hard time disciplining Zinn in any way because they know that there are always 500 students that are ready to demonstrate. That didn't happen at Spelman. He was kicked out, and it's interesting because he did consider legal action. He said he had the right. I thought it was interesting because here's a guy that's like, all about fighting. But he said, look, this was down to like whoever could pay lawyers more. And I thought that was a really interesting bit of pragmatism from him, because that's how I would feel about it too. It's sort of like, well, who has the money to litigate this? And if I'm just like some professor that just got fired, I don't have the lawyers to litigate this. So I'm just gonna head up north. And he ends up with an appointment at Boston University, where he is during like the hot 1960s.
One place that jumped out at me in terms of the connection between his time in the civil rights movement and his time in the anti-war movement that connects the two in a way that I often think of in terms of like King and Baldwin, but not necessarily other figures, was when he was thinking about the civil rights movement in the South and like kind of whether or not the sit-ins and demonstrations and all the arrests that happened to him, his students, his colleagues, whether or not it was like a revolution or what it was. And he takes great pains to say, for him, revolution is the wrong idea, and so was armed rebellion. He says, to me, it came to mean just a combination of daring forays and patient pushing, as I saw in the South, the long march through the institutions, as someone described it. And then he goes on to say, I began to realize no pitifully small picket line, no poorly attended meeting, no tossing out of an idea to an audience or even to an individual should be scorned as insignificant. And it goes back to that small acts idea that we just mentioned.
Yeah.
But what struck me here was, is he talking about the civil rights movement or is he talking about the anti-war movement? Because there's this idea that the little things that you did, standing up to the authority and to the institution, to the war machine, that each little act was significant. And, there was multiple incidents about people setting themselves on fire.
Yeah.
And how there was these person had said to him that there were villages in Vietnam where the villagers didn't know any English words except for the name of this guy that set himself on
Norman
fire.
Morrison. Yeah.
Norman Morrison.
Mm-hmm.
That I felt was extremely moving, but also it was a way to connect this thesis of the small act that's the rolling tide.
Yeah.
That changes segregation, but also forces another kind of ending to the war. Would you agree with that as we move to like some of those war years?
Yeah, no, totally. And it gets I mean, that's the basis of a people's history, right? Is eventually he's going to write a book that's about exactly the notion you're describing there, which is that this idea that the small acts of resistance, even if they look pointless or invisible or failures in some way, they add up. I mean, one of the things the stories he tells is he tells a story of a black doctor in Georgia who is like the only doctor that takes care of black people in this town, and he gets in trouble. What does he get in trouble for? He's on a party line back. For those that don't know, phones used to have like lots of people on them. There'd be like other people on the phone, and a white woman called him the N-word. A white woman said, get off the phone, and called him the N-word. And he's a doctor talking to his patient, and he replies, why don't you get off the phone, you bitch? And that was an obscenity against a white woman. He was arrested. That was the end of that doctor in that town. And Zinn points that out to be like, look, like that was a sad, tragic thing to see the doctor go. But there was like also a feeling in the town that like he had done something important, and there was like that act of resistance. So that's one of them. The other one that I think is more significant is that Zinn wrote about, I think it was part of a state project, right? Or a university project that he wrote about the incident, the events that unfolded in Albany, Georgia, and what was called the Albany movement. It's a really important event in the whole trajectory of the civil rights movement, and why it's usually considered important when you look at like major histories of that era. This happened in like 1961 and 1962. It's usually described as important because there were some leaders there that became leaders later, but also because it failed. The Albany movement failed to effectively end segregation, and the racial situation didn't change in Albany. So what Zinn ends up doing is going and writing about Albany and saying, no, like it's wrong to see it as a failure. It's important to see it as part of a larger context. And this little bit that he writes about Albany and why he was there to me really gets at something that I think is going to be important when we get to a people's history. So I want to read this quick point. He says, in my report for the Southern Regional Council, I was searching for a central focus. Here, in concentrated form, was the racism, the brutality of the segregated South. Just one instance. Mrs. Slater King, C.B. King's sister-in-law, with her 3 children and in her 6th month of pregnancy, tried to bring food to someone in jail. She was kicked and knocked to the ground by a deputy sheriff. She lost consciousness. Months later, she lost her baby. A question kept nagging at me. Where was the government of the United States in all this? I taught courses in constitutional law, but that expertise was not necessary for a person to see that the First Amendment and 14th Amendment rights in the United States Constitution were being violated in Albany again and again. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the equal protection of the law. I could count at least 30 such violations. Yet the president, sworn to uphold the Constitution, and all the agency of the United States government at his disposal were nowhere to be seen. Was Albany, Georgia, was all of the South outside the jurisdiction of the United States? Had the Confederacy really won the Civil War and morally effectively seceded? That to me is like a really devastating conclusion to come to, and it also is
about the Kennedy administration too.
Totally, yeah, and it's also a sign of things to come in terms of Zinn's thinking, because he's really good, I think. And I noticed that in the documentary they mentioned this. This isn't mentioned in the book, but in the documentary they mentioned this, that when he was writing A People's History of the United States, the only editor he had was his wife Rosalind, who he was married to from 1944 to her death in 2008. And he said that she was someone that he chose as an editor because he trusted her sense of storytelling, that she was a voracious reader, not of academic books, but of novels, and that she was really good at sort of taking his raw material and shaping it into this compelling story. And I can't help thinking about that with that notion that he brings up there about the Civil War. That's sort of like a clickbaity thing. Like, did the South actually win the Civil War? Like, it's such a, BuzzFeed type headline. But he's good at that. I think that's a skill he has, and it's one that he's going to build on as a writer. And maybe his wife is part of that. Is sort of like kind of intriguing you about this story, the quote unquote real story of American history. And he does so by telling really intense pieces of things like the Civil Rights Movement and Vietnam. And it's definitely a part of his power to me as an early reader of Zinn, was his ability to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess that answers part of our question, because it means that one of the reasons why he doesn't have professional capital among professional academics is because he writes stories about history, or writes history in the form of narrative in a way that isn't consistent with academic history, which is often argumentative.
Call it what you will, it's not history.
Yeah, well, or it's like, thing about academic history is it's full of secondary sources.
Right.
It's full of XYZ said, it's been interpreted this way, because there's such a the premium that's placed on higher education scholarship, which is completely consistent with capitalism, is you need to distinctly enunciate your unique perspective. So
and also to describe the historiography and sort of where your argument rests in the larger legacy of arguments that have been made about this. Zinn doesn't do that.
Right.
Zinn writes straight through the story.
He's writing for a popular audience, if you will, or a mass audience, and so it gets to be a question of genre. And
totally.
I guess the question is it really the case that PhD programs don't value works of popular historical narrative, such as Zinn's? Or is it the case that those programs in certain fields haven't figured out a way to grapple, negotiate, incorporate, collaborate with those kinds of texts? So in other words, I think that it's too simple to say academia why do you only value other academic work? Because the answer is kind of self-obvious. I think a better question would be, academia, why has it taken you so long to juggle different kinds of genres of history and incorporate them into kind of new frameworks and understandings or methods, et cetera?
Yeah,
So
no,
I
that's
think
great.
that's something to come back to.
Yeah, it's sort of like it makes me this is so random, but it makes me think of like the Da Vinci Code.
Right.
Like the Da Vinci Code is a super popular book, right? I mean, honestly, one of the most popular bestsellers of our lives, I think, is the Da Vinci Code. You couldn't avoid reading that. Like at some point, like everyone had the Da Vinci Code, and it was, I
Good
think
predecessor to QAnon.
totally, yeah. Because look what we're saying is this idea that there is a dark secret history just underneath the surface that you've missed. And if you're paying attention and if you listen to my elucidation of this history, you will learn amazing things about the what's on the dollar bill and what the Mona Lisa is really about. And it seems like I'd love to see, like, how does academia take on something like the Da Vinci Code as history? Because when I read the Da Vinci Code, the whole time I was like, is this fucking real? Is this true? Like, it made me want to read more. It was about our world, even though it's like a novel. It's about like these secrets.
Oh, sure. But you sound a little bit like an English professor right now, so you're starting to scare me.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's part of what you and I have thought about a lot, is sort of like the interdisciplinary element of doing any kind of scholarship. And I don't think what we do on Nostalgia Trap is necessarily quote unquote scholarship in an official way, but it does reflect a lot of how we think. And a lot of how we think, I think we can't help but grab different disciplinary methodologies in order to figure the world out. And to me, Da Vinci Code's popularity is important. I mean, you just mentioned Q, right? Like, it's Da Vinci Code I would include that on like a genealogical framework towards QAnon. So yeah, maybe we ought to be studying some things like that. And yeah, I think that's what we'll get to when we want to talk about people's history of the United States, and we'll do that. We'll save that for part 2. But let's talk a little bit about Vietnam, because you brought that up as sort of like, to me, I think that's where Zinn becomes even more of a publicly known figure. He writes that book that you gave me years ago. It's back here on the shelf somewhere, Justin. You gave me an original copy of Howard Zinn's The Logic of Withdrawal, Vietnam, The Logic of Withdrawal.
I think when you left New York.
Yeah, and you wrote a nice little epitaph. Is it epitaph? Is that the right? I don't think that's the right word.
I could be.
You wrote something nice in there about the podcast, etc. And it's a book I treasure, in part because of what you've written in it, but also because it's like this. It looks like the kind of book that like some communist would hand you in Washington Square Park, right? It's like a little pamphlet. And what was famous about it, and what got famous about it, I think that parts of it were published in the New York Times. I think, it was something that like was around. But what's famous about it is at the end of this book, in which Zinn lays out in a very straightforward, unemotional way, here's why, the United States ought to get out of Vietnam. He writes a like sort of fictional speech that Lyndon Johnson could give. And he's like, here's what President Lyndon Johnson should say if he wanted to get out of the Vietnam War gracefully and actually be a hero to the world. And it's a really extraordinary speech. We won't reproduce it here. I urge those of you who are interested to seek it out, though, because you can find it online. That's the part, I think that's really fascinating, right? Is like, that's what made Howard Zinn a little famous during the 60s, is his writing of this imaginative speech from Lyndon Johnson. And the other element of it that I just wanted to mention before you tell us your Vietnam bits, Justin, is how he gets chosen to go overseas and be part of this small contingent of anti-war representatives who the North Vietnamese government have agreed to transfer these 3 American prisoners of war to. It happens while he's in class. Like, Howard Zinn is like in class at Boston University lecturing or doing something with students, and like he's told there's a phone call for him, and he's like, I'm in class, and they're like, it's a phone call. So he runs out to the hallway, and it's Staunton Lind. I think that's a professor that's a buddy of his that's also like a lefty professor, who tells him, look, this is happening and we want you to be a part of this. And there's going to be a plane and you're going to get on it tomorrow and go to North Vietnam and be gone for maybe 2 weeks. And I think it's interesting that he said his first thought in his head was like, well, how will my classes be covered? And the other part of it was Roz, my wife, would want me to go. And that to me was really, there was something really moving about that. The sort of how well he knows his wife and how well he knows his wife's sense of himself and justice and things like that. And that like his immediate thought was, I got to do this for Roz. There's something really touching about that.
One of my favorite parts about the documentary was seeing the pictures of those two as young people.
Total
they
hippies,
were both,
man. Yeah.
But they were also both like pretty stunningly attractive people,
Yes.
both of them. And I was just like, wow.
Yeah, they're like gorgeous.
Would have loved to have partied with those two.
Zinn is super tall. She has like long, straight hair, the documentary was amazing because I'd never seen young pictures of Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn always came off to me as this kind of like old New Yorker guy that showed up at all the rallies in his in his army jacket and gave a heartfelt speech about power and war. But to see him young and to see that they were like truly like in the most stereotypical way, there were those idealistic young radicals that for better or worse shifted a lot of history in the 1960s. To see them and to understand that this was the most important element of their lives, really, was their sense of being involved in these movements is really something. Yeah.
He relates at one point when he is having like an old timers conversation about the civil rights movement with all the veterans of the civil rights movement. And he says, he ends a chapter by saying, everybody agreed it was like the most dangerous, risky, crazy, horrific period we ever lived in, and that it was the best time of our lives. And I think that speaks to kind of what you're saying here, but I also think it speaks to something that Robert once told me about the Black Panthers. And he was like, the Black Panthers borrowed a fashion tip from the fascists, that the Panthers dressed for sex and like, but by God, they were good looking.
Yeah.
And he was right about that. And it makes me realize in the passages on Vietnam where Zinn's talking about, meeting Donald Sutherland and Jane Fonda and Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and Country Joe and the Beatles, like he's around that whole countercultural movement. And when you look at the pictures, he is this charismatic, handsome, tall activist guy. And when you look at all of the, how do I say this correctly? When you look at Baldwin, when you look at King, when you look at Malcolm X, when you look at, I'm just naming people at random here a little bit.
They're like
here, but
celebrities. They're like stars.
They're stars.
Yeah. You want a poster of them on the wall.
And Zinn was a star.
Yep.
And I think that is something to try to recover through this text. And in a passage where he's talking about this, he writes, for most of us, the movement was a life-giving force. To join 100,000 others in marches and rallies, to know that even if you felt helpless against the power of the government, you were not alone in your feelings, that people all over the country of all ages, black and white, working people and middle-class people were with you, was to be moved beyond words. Now, that's important because, again, he's defining solidarity. And it includes an interracial coalition. It also includes a class coalition. And it obviously includes a left and liberal coalition. That is worth preserving in terms of not only thinking about the abolition movement, the civil rights movement, but also the anti-war movement. And it's worth contrasting that today. It really is. And
it makes me wonder, actually, and I'm excited to read passages from people's history for part 2 of this, Justin, because it makes me wonder, like, how does he frame like Black nationalism? Because people's history, he talks about everything. Like it's meant to be a survey. How does he frame Black nationalism? I'll be interested because it doesn't seem like, as much as I think he's going to understand where Black nationalism comes from, it doesn't seem like it's his style. Like he's all about like the interracial solidarity angle, like for him, that's where progress comes from. But at the same time, I think he's enormously sympathetic to people like the Panthers, etc.
Yeah, he is. Oh, he definitely is. And in this kind of passage and reflection where he's talking about the movement and what kind of alliances there were, and he is name checking people like Muhammad Ali, and he's going through this stack of voices. He ends that by saying, When you see all of them, it was to feel that the best of human beings were fighting your cause. So it wasn't just I'm in a sea of people. It was also like I'm seeing the best people in their fields, like Ali or Dylan or whatever. And it matters to me that that kind of creative, talented person also feels this way about the war. And he goes on in discussing their feelings as an embattled minority, but with this beautiful humanity. But he goes on to say this, and I think it points back to something we've said a lot this year, and that's one reason why it really sticks out. He says, we often read in the press or heard from some people that the opposition to the war came from young people wanting to save their own lives. That was so clearly untrue. Millions of people protested the war not because their own lives were at stake, but because they truly cared about other people's lives, the lives of the Vietnamese and of fellow Americans.
Mm-hmm.
That, to me, is a nuke bomb. Oh, that's a bad analogy. That's a bomb going off, not a nuke bomb.
Yeah.
That's a bomb going off in my own thinking, because that gets back to that Ortiz idea of emancipatory internationalism. And it gets back to these questions of sentimentalism. It gets back to these questions of sympathy. It gets back to these questions of solidarity. And again, these are all questions.
Yeah.
But it starts to pose this idea about where radical breakthroughs come from, what they feel like, whether or not they're sustainable or unsustainable. But it's this idea that other people's lives includes the lives of people who live in other parts of the world. Now, there's places to pressure that we've done before that I don't really need to get into right now, but I do want to preserve his definitions here of solidarity, of movement culture, and of care, if you will.
Yeah, and he's really, I think, offended by the idea that you would interpret all of those movements of the 1950s and 60s as movements of self-interest. Even the civil rights movement, which for him is the classic example in 60s literature of the white new left, right? Is that the white new left were, and I don't think this really applies to Zinn really, but the stereotype is that the white new left were middle class kids raised in affluence and comfort, who were now being trained in some of the best universities the world has ever created, and they are very unhappy and they're activists. And why is that? And the classic sort of idea about that is that the civil rights movement was the entryway into the left for those white kids. And it was about other people. It was about sort of like a movement for others. To me, that's what's interesting about the trajectory of the 60s is how all of that gets confused by the end of the 1960s. By the end of the 1960s, you have SDS coming apart on college campuses in 1969 over race, over violence, over like, who are we fighting for? Are we liberating ourselves? Are we fighting for others? It's should we be fighting for others? Like, is that something we should do? All of that are questions that are sort of the heart of the conflict that happened within the left in the 1960s. And to see Zinn sort of understanding that and understanding that there are that the progress or whatever happened in the 1960s was in part fueled by people who did have a sense of solidarity with people that weren't like them, and that part of it is the element that I'd like to recapture as we head into part 2 and thinking about people's history. Yeah,
I have one final comment that's along these lines, and it goes back to his friend Stoughton Lynn, if that's the pronunciation. And one of the things that I think we should take away from this memoir, from this autobiography, is that Zinn seems to say that you can draw theoretical lessons from your personal relationships and experiences. That when you're living history, you can historicize history based on your own experiences, and that this is partly why it matters that everyday people are historical figures, which I think is one of the theses that's the root of people's history. And when you start to say not only that other people's lives matter, but that other people's lives are historical, that they are actors, not just recipients of political institutions and politics, you start to create new ways of understanding theories of social change, let's say. So here's how I'd like to end it. It's from the end of the book when he's kind of reflecting on some of these things, and he reflects on that guy Stoughton Lynn, and he says they became friends, and the summer before Lynn came south, we met in New England. We decided to climb a New Hampshire mountain. His 2 children came with us, or meaning Zinns. They were 13 and 11. They got to the summit of the mountain and were smoking cigarettes that they found. There was an empty pack of cigarettes on the top of this mountain. None of them smoked, but they're smoking. And Zinn says, the mountain climbing conversation was illuminating. Stoughton came from a background completely different from mine. His parents were quite famous professors at Columbia and Sarah Lawrence. Stoughton had been raised in comfortable circumstances, had gone to Harvard and Columbia, and yet, as we went back and forth on every political issue under the sun, and he mentions race, class, war, violence, nationalism, justice, fascism, capitalism, socialism, blah, 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 it was clear that our social philosophies, our values were extraordinarily similar. And he goes on to say, in the light of such experiences, traditional dogmatic class analysis cannot remain intact. But as dogma disintegrates, hope appears, because it seems that human beings, whatever their backgrounds, are more open than we think, that their behavior cannot be confidently predicted from their past, that we are all creatures vulnerable to new thoughts, new attitudes. And while such vulnerability creates all sorts of possibilities, both good and bad, its very existence is exciting. It means that no human being should be written off. No change in thinking deemed impossible. Dude, that's to me is one of the themes of this first episode. That's one of the main lessons of Zinn's life. And note that he uses his own friendships to reinterpret Marxism. I think that is fucking fantastic.
I agree, and it's a wonderful note to lead us into the next piece. It makes me think of, I follow Sister Helen Prejean on Twitter. She's a nun and an activist against the death penalty, and she's the person that was depicted by Susan Sarandon in Dead Man Walking. And I've always been interested in her because she seems like such a radical. And what I mean by that is she's someone who says that people on death row shouldn't be written off, and that they're human beings and that they deserve our forgiveness and mercy and redemption, or at least opportunity for redemption. And that to me is incredibly radical. Like it's so radical that I don't even know if I agree with it a lot of times,
Of course.
Right? But part of it to me is it links to what you just mentioned about Zinn, which is an important part of his whole, the thrust of his whole project is seeing people as movable and as fluid beings and worthy of our attempts to redeem them, etc. You can't be neutral on a moving train. What do you think of that title? Because that title basically is the whole thesis in a lot of ways, right? He's saying you can't just accept what where the train is headed, because if you're neutral on a moving train, you are accepting it.
You got to change the direction of the train if you can. But part of what he says is you do that not only by getting in the train in listening and talking to people, but by believing that the people that you've already assigned as your enemies are capable of change. That supposition, which to me doesn't exist very much today, that supposition that enemies deserve a kind of engagement. And he talks about nonviolent direct action a lot in the civil rights movement part, but also he certainly applies that to Vietnam. That the idea that you're going to change the world by engaging your enemy through pacifism is one of the strangest, most brilliant, most frustrating wagers that we can imagine. And there's not one movie that I can think of that's made $100 million in the last 50 years that resolves crisis through pacifism.
Right.
And well, I'll take that fucking back. I'll take it back. But I'm just saying that the story that he's trying to tell isn't a dominant strain in the stories that we're often told. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, and look at what it took, a lifetime of learning for Zinn to get to that, because when he initially hears about, and this is my final point, I swear to God, because we want to wrap up Zinn's life here. But when Zinn first encounters injustice in his so-called, Dickensian childhood, poverty, etc.
When he was reading Dickens, by the way.
Right, that's right. He is and obsessed with Dickens, and says that it was an important moment for him to understand that there were other people in the world that experienced poverty and people that were different from him. But yeah, when he hears about injustice and his initial thoughts about it, and he hears about bullies and fascist bullies, what does he want to do? He wants to kill them. He wants to smash them. He wants to join the American military and go fucking burn those people to death. And that's what he does. But it takes a lifetime for him to understand something a little bit different about how you approach change in the world and how you approach the bully. I think it's worth debating. It's not something that I'm settled on for sure, but I think it's going to come out into people's history, because that's what we're going to do next, Justin, is we're going to take on that book that Matt Damon in Good Will Hunting says to Robin Williams, if you want to know the real history of the United States, why don't you read fucking Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States? That was honestly probably the first time I ever heard the name Howard Zinn, etc.
Boston.
And in that movie, Robin Williams responds, have you ever read Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent? And I was like, what the fuck are these books? Like, again, the secret history underneath it all. It's very intriguing. But we're going to look at that secret history. I'm really looking forward to this. Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, what we'll look at next, a book that is...
with some other books around it, if possible.
With some other books around it. I think we want to read his The Bomb as well.
Definitely.
Yeah. So we'll take a look at the actual... We've talked about Howard Zinn's life. Next time we're going to be talking about his work and what he's given us, and try to figure out the ins and outs of all of that. So thank you, Justin. This was really fun. I like learning about Howard Zinn this week.
Me too. Thank you.
Well, all right. That's going to wrap up part 1 of our trilogy on the life and work and legacy of Howard Zinn. Very much looking forward to sharing part 2 of this trilogy on our subscriber feed. You can find that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, along with all of our bonus stuff, including our movie club. Our next movie club meeting is December 10th, by the way. We'll be watching the 1951 Billy Wilder, Kirk Douglas film, Ace in the Hole. Very much looking forward to talking with you guys about that stuff. So patreon.com/nostalgiatrap is where you can sign up for that and hear us talk about A People's History of the United States, which is really why I wanted to do this trilogy, is because that book meant so much to me. So thank you, Justin, for reading this material, bringing your thoughts and ideas. I really appreciate it. And we'll talk to all of you very soon. All right, take care. Bye-bye.